Hello, and welcome to a History of Egypt podcast interview. My guest today is Professor Peter Brand, who returns to the show to explore more aspects of the reign of Ramesses II. In this episode, we discuss the later wars that this king undertook in Canaan and Syria, and then his monumental peace treaty with the Hittite Empire. It's a lovely discussion. I hope you enjoy. Good morning, Professor Brand. Welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast for another conversation about Ramesses. How are you today?
Good morning. It's nice to see you again.
It's been about a week since we did our epic conversation on the Battle of Kadesh. And today we're going to move more into the aftermath of that and the diplomatic, geostrategic context of what comes later. In terms of the aftermath of Kadesh, last time we left off with your observation that when you really break it down, the outcomes are not as dramatic as Ramesses' propaganda would imply. And you described it as, in your words, a nothing burger in terms of how it really changes the Syrian Canaanite situation. The key thing to explore now is what comes after the Battle of Kadesh and the military front. So by the time this episode or this interview goes out, I will have run through the later wars of Ramesses II through his first decade and maybe early into the second decade. From your studies and analyses of the sources, how do you view these later wars of Ramesses in Canaan and Syria? Was he, as earlier scholars liked to suggest, responding to generalized rebellions, maybe caused by his stalemate at Kadesh, or is he actually pursuing a classic expansionist, aggressive policy?
Well, that's an interesting question. And before we go too far, I better qualify what I said about Kadesh being something of a nothing burger. I was framing that in terms of the overall strategic situation between Egypt and the Hittites, in the sense that this didn't settle the question of the Egyptian-Hittite conflict that had been dragging on ever since the later reign of Akhenaten. And just as there had been multiple battles of Kadesh going back to the time of Akhenaten with Tutankhamun, with probably Horemheb, and with Seti I, none of which settled the question and which led, even with Seti I, to yet another, in fact, the Battle of Kadesh with Ramesses II, even though there was not yet another Battle of Kadesh afterwards. The final Battle of Kadesh under Ramesses II did not solve the Egyptian-Hittite conflict. So in that sense, it didn't change anything in the strategic front. However, this does not mean that there was no effect on the Hittite conflict, nor did it not have any kind of effect on Ramses' military agenda. In the aftermath of the battle, there were at least two major campaigns that Ramses fought in his 8th and 10th regnal year. Remember, he fought the Battle of Kadesh in his 5th year. So at least 3 years after the Battle of Kadesh, he brings his armies into Canaan and Syria once again. And then 2 years after that, in his 10th year, it's even possible that sometime, perhaps in year 6 or 7, there is another campaign, but it's hard to date, that actually takes place in Moab and Edom on the far side of the Sea of Galilee. If this is separate from the year 8 campaign, and the dating is a bit tricky. Now, the whole question, of course, is in these later campaigns, especially the fighting that takes place in Canaan, is this a reaction to Ramses' failings at the Battle of Kadesh, inasmuch as that he did not succeed in his ambitions to take the city? And especially if you view him as having taken a drubbing in the battle, especially if one imagines that it was such a military setback that it weakened his armies, and perhaps that his vassals in Canaan and Lebanon smelled blood in the water and figured that now was the time to rise up in a rebellion against their imperial overlord, the pharaoh. And this is a classic situation that various subject peoples under the thumb of an imperial power often did. And there were other cases of this, not just in modern history or, say, classical history, but even in ancient Near Eastern history. This is how some of the Mesopotamian empires fell apart. If this was the case in Canaan in the years after the Battle of Kadesh, and this is only a possibility, I'm not saying, like others have claimed, that the whole of Canaan and Lebanon, where Egypt had hegemony, went up in flames. But if this, in fact, did happen, then the Canaanite vassals of Pharaoh were sorely mistaken, because Ramesses came back with a vengeance. And it seems that quite handily, he was able to put down any talk of rebellion or any moves towards asserting the independence of the Canaanite vassals who would dare to oppose Egypt's interest. And even in the worst case scenario, I suspect that there was a limited amount or limited number of any of these Canaanite city-states that were erstwhile vassals of Pharaoh that actually would now try to resist. But there are other possibilities that would explain what was going on during these two later campaigns in terms of what he was up to in Canaan. One is he went out on yet another one of these military campaigns that was another example of this kind of chariot diplomacy, and that perhaps, like Seti I in the first year of his reign, he was itching for a fight to, prove his credentials after the setback at Kadesh. And he was on a tripwire, and that anybody who got in his way, who showed the slightest gumption, that he would, attack. But the other thing we have to consider is that some of the language the Egyptians used, the traditional rhetoric that they used, is that of the enemy or the subject peoples, quote unquote, rebelling. The ideology of warfare is that the enemy is always rebelling against Egyptian power. So it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. There may have been, in fact, disloyal Canaanite vassals, but to the extent that any opposition to Pharaoh or any excuse for warfare on the part of the Egyptian kings is couched in the language of rebellion, then we have to take some of this with a grain of salt.
That point about the language of warfare always being a response to rebellion as a sort of almost blasphemous disruption of the natural order was an interesting one that I hadn't considered. The answer to this question may be obvious, but historically we have many references from the Hittite annals that will talk about rebellions or conflicts in the region, a classic example being the rebellion of Nuhashi, taking place towards the end of Shubululiyuma. Do we hear anything even remotely similar to this taking place in the later annals, Muwatalli, Hattusili? Do any of their surviving records discuss ongoing conflict in this region?
Now, as far as I'm aware, we don't have these kind of records for Muwatalli, that at least part of these events took place of. The other thing is, shortly after the Battle of Kadesh, Muwatalli II dies, and his successor is a young prince who takes the name of, I think it's Musili III, but he's better known as Uri Teshup. And Uri Teshup rules for several years. We don't know precisely how long, but he's going to be a key figure, because after a relatively brief reign, he will be overthrown by his uncle, the brother of Muwatalli, Hattusili, who will then become Hattusili III. We'll see this play out very much in the diplomatic relations between the two kingdoms. But Uriteshep will be king during a time in which Ramses' later campaigns are unfolding. And because of his ultimate fate politically back home, he has not left us, or at least no records have been preserved of any of his annals to tell us what was going on between he and Egypt. And so we don't have the Hittite version of events going on in Ramses' later wars. So unfortunately, we have again a rather one-sided view. The other problem is that unlike this very elaborate account of the Battle of Kadesh, we don't have that much detail about Ramses' later wars, mostly just these rhetorical battle scenes that mainly give us the name of the fortresses of the enemy towns that the king is conquering. The most elaborate detail is given about a place north of Kadesh in central Syria called Dapur, where the king conquers the city. And what's most interesting about that is an account of the king's personal bravery and an echo of his heroic actions at Kadesh, where he claims that he was able to fight or that he almost recklessly fought, shooting arrows at the place for a couple of hours without putting on his body armor. And he boasts in this rather chatty speech where he drones on about how he kept fighting and shooting arrows without putting his body armor on. He actually repeats himself, and so this was probably a verbatim record. And you can just imagine this pharaoh that just loved to talk about himself and blah blah blah, and kept on reminding everybody, in case you hadn't heard, that he did this without putting his body armor. Oh, by the way, did I mention I wasn't wearing my body armor? Because I wasn't wearing my body armor for 2 hours, and so he sort of he sort of repeats himself. But this idea that he was taking a deliberate risk here by showing this sort of bravado. By taking a chance, because if some Hittite archer had gotten a lucky shot, that would have ended the glorious reign of Ramses II in year 8. And a lot of things wouldn't have happened, and who we would have probably had King Amenhotep I, who was his eldest son, and the whole course of Egyptian history would have changed. And Ramses II, if not being a footnote, would have been something of a lesser figure in history. Be that as it may, this is one of the most detailed, if not the most detailed, events of his later campaigns after the Battle of Kadesh.
I think last time when we were speaking about the ideological filter of the sources, I compared Ramesses to Rambo and how he appears in 80s action films. And when you were mentioning the sort of repetition of, I wasn't wearing armor, you can almost imagine him slathering body oil all over himself and just unloading it.
Yeah, I don't know about the
off.
body oil, but certainly he's being macho by deliberately going out there without his protection and saying hit me with your best shot, to quote a horrible song from the 1980s, and I dare you. And meanwhile, his sons are shown fighting in some of these battle scenes, but they are wisely hiding behind these big arrow blinds, so they don't get taken out. But meanwhile, Big Daddy is there. Although it's interesting because in the scenes of the battle, we see Ramses fighting on foot, but he is wearing his battle armor at this point.
So Ramesses does aggressively push forward into Syria. Even if he doesn't try to take Kadesh again, he does bypass it and go further into what we would consider the Hittite sphere of influence, so to speak. And that takes us up roughly to year 10. And I know at the very least, Kitchen posited there might have been later battles in the second decade, but at least in the Ultimate Pharaoh, you broadly finish his military endeavors with the year 10 campaign. By the time we next really hear about the Hittites, another 11 years have passed, and that brings us all the way up to year 21 of Ramesses. At this point, he's probably in his early 40s. Perhaps his fighting days are, now coming to an end, just on the physical side of things. And in year 21, we see the signing, quote unquote, of a treaty, a formal agreement of peace between Ramesses and the Hittite ruler, in this case, Hattusili III. The first essential question, just to set the scene, is what geopolitical factors do you think were the main driver for this treaty? What caused them to make peace at this point?
Well, this is an interesting question that has been debated among scholars for quite a while. And even the way you phrased the question sets out a particular viewpoint that the two sides were motivated by quote unquote geopolitical considerations. And of course, you have these two empires. You have the Hittite Empire and you have the Egyptian Empire, and they're part of this, if you will, a club of great kingdoms, the Great Powers Club. Another charter member of this group was the Babylonian Empire, that was off to the south and the east, which maintained peaceful relations with both the Hittites and the Egyptians, in part because they were so far away that they were no threat to either the other two. There used to be in Upper Mesopotamia what was called the Mitanni Empire, which had given both the Egyptians and the Hittites a run for their money during the 18th dynasty, until the Hittite king Shapuli-Uliuma had destroyed it and left a rump state called Hani-Galbat, which the Hittites had dominated. One of the former vassals of Mitanni was the old kingdom of Assyria. And now Assyria was a rising power that was even moving up to the banks of the Euphrates River. And the classic explanation for why the Hittites suddenly felt the need to bury the hatchet with Egypt, and perhaps even suggesting why Egypt was receptive to this, was the idea that the Hittites were worried about fighting some kind of two-front war against Egypt and a resurgent Assyrian Empire. And therefore, with the Assyrians seeming to be intransigent and ambitious towards the Hittites' Syrian possessions, even that they might move to the western side of the Euphrates River, that the Hittites sort of took the wise and strategically sound move to approach the pharaoh to make peace and thereby, close off one of the two fronts. It makes eminent political and geostrategic sense, and has been advocated by various scholars, at least since the 1950s, when this fellow named Roughton proposed it. I don't believe it for a second. I don't think that that's the kind of way that ancient kings thought about things. I don't imagine that, in the Hittite high command, or the Egyptian one for that matter, that they were sitting around some kind of map of the ancient Near East in the Hittite situation room with all these little markers showing the Hittite and Egyptian and Assyrian troops plotting grand strategy. That's just not the way it works. That's a very anachronistic, sort of out of time kind of way of viewing things. And as far as being surrounded by enemies, well, this was nothing new for the Hittites. They weren't just, facing off enemies on their southeast and south borders. They were used to being surrounded by enemies 360 degrees. And why would they now be worried about the Assyrians? And if you read the handful of letters, diplomatic correspondence that we have between them, they were not pulling any punches and trying to be polite and nice towards the Assyrians. Uri Tessep wrote a very rude letter to the Assyrian king, telling him what he thought of him, and it wasn't particularly pleasant. And therefore, it doesn't sound like they were particularly worried. We might imagine, with knowledge of hindsight, that this was a threat because we think about the Neo-Assyrian Empire that had conquered the entire Near East, but this was a few hundred years in the future, and they didn't know that one day Assyria would conquer all of the Near East, including Egypt. So why would they be that particularly worried about Assyria? In fact, the real sort of nitty gritty realist issues that the Hittite king was concerned about was actually political. And it was domestic policy, because at this point, the king who was in charge of Hatti was this fellow named Hattusili III. He had overthrown his nephew Uriteshep. He's the brother of Mu'tali and the uncle of Uriteshep. He has seized the throne by coup d'etat, and because he has taken over the throne, he is illegitimate. And the whole agenda of his reign is to demonstrate his legitimacy by various means. And one of the best ways to establish his legitimacy is to get other great kings among the diplomatic powers to accept him and recognize him as a great king. So he seeks out diplomatic recognition. He tries it with Babylon, he tries it with the Assyrians, and the Assyrians basically tell him what he can go and do. He has limited success with the Babylonians. At first, he makes a deal with the older king of Babylon, who then unfortunately dies, and the new king of Babylon is not as receptive. And there's only one other guy he can turn to make a deal with, and that's the pharaoh. And Ramesses decides to play hard to get. And even worse, the deposed nephew, Uriteshep, goes running on the lam, and guess where he ends up? He ends up at the court of Ramesses II. And so, from the perspective of the Hittites, a lot of this had to do with politics. And in fact, they had been apparently trying for several years to get the Egyptians to make a peace deal, but Ramesses kept refusing. Now, from the Egyptian perspective, from Ramesses' perspective, a peace deal was not necessarily the best outcome, because they had a stalemate in Syria. And the idea, it's sort of bit like what's going on in Ukraine in some ways. It was a political reality, or a geostrategic reality. In this case, the geostrategy does come into it. The reality is that the Egyptians were never going to be able to get back Syria through peace negotiations or military offensive. They could not take back any of these places in Syria. Even when they conquered some of these Syrian places like Dapur in Ramesses' later campaigns, as soon as his armies went home, the Hittites came right back in. So any victories were temporary. So the Hittites had no reason to hand over the territory, because they knew even if Ramesses seized anything, they would just get it back. So the idea that the Hittites were going to hand any of these territories over in a peace deal was laughable. So Ramesses had to accept that any peace deal would not involve trading peace for land in his favor. So if he made peace, he was essentially signing away any claims to Syria. And so that was a big pill to swallow, a very bitter one. So what is he going to do? And why should he make peace? Well, for quite a while, he decided, why should I make peace? Why should I sign a deal? And so he played hard to get for quite a while.
We'll be back with more Peter Brand after the break. See you in a moment.
So that brings us now to the actual treaty itself. Again, by the time this interview goes out, I will have done a full episode breakdown with the Ultimate Pharaoh as a major source for the treaty substance. So I'd like to focus on a couple of salient features that you highlight rather than the entire body of the text. The first thing that might surprise a modern reader coming at it from a 21st century perspective and expectations on what treaties between great powers look like. The Silver Treaty seems to lack certain things that we might consider a standard part of a treaty. There's no mention in the text of borders, spheres of influence, or that sort of thing. There are references to vassals and fugitives, but they don't set hard limits on the Egyptian Hittite border, quote unquote. To your understanding of the text and the likely historical background around it, what the diplomats are doing, how are the Egyptians and the Hittites settling that particular issue if it's not included in the text of the treaty?
Well, on the one hand, if you do look at other treaties, and mostly these are what we call vassal treaties between the Hittites and their subject territories, they don't also have these kind of, geographical markers. So it may have been just the kind of thing that was not talked about in treaties. But then again, this treaty between Egypt and Hatti, what we might call a parity treaty between two equal powers, were exceedingly rare, and this is the only one we have that's substantially well preserved. There are fragments of an earlier Egyptian-Hittite treaty that was made in the middle 18th dynasty, but we only have bits and pieces of it, so it's hard to say whether that had any similar. But it was actually made at a time when the two kingdoms did not share a mutual border, when they were separated by the Mitannian Empire and its control of Syria. So there are a couple of things that we may attribute to this lack of reference to any kind of Egyptian-Hittite final border. One is that it was so obvious that there was no reason to discuss it, that Kadesh and Amru now were understood as belonging permanently to the Hittites, and their borders were defined. And the northern Lebanon and the region known as Upe, which is in the northern part of the Bekaa Valley and the region around Damascus, as well as another territory in the region called Amki, that these were the northernmost realms of the Egyptians. And since their borders were more or less understood, although, again, we can't think of lines on a map because this is not exactly how geography was understood in the ancient mind or the ancient world, that everybody knew what belonged to whom, and so there was no need to discuss it. But part of this was as well the fact that both sides knew that the Egyptians were going to have to give up their dreams of a greater Egyptian empire in Syria. And that was, again, a bitter pill for Ramesses to swallow. And it was just a fact. And to spell it out in detail on the treaty in so many words, to say that henceforth Kadesh and Amru and all parts of Syria shall not be shall belong to Hatti, and that Ramesses shall never come into it, to spell it out in so many words would be deeply humiliating to Ramesses. And so by not mentioning it, you could call this something of a gentleman's agreement, or as they say in that Monty Python episode, the old Fawlty Towers and episode, don't mention the war, don't talk about it. And you could say this is something of a gentleman's agreement that is meant to save face, so as not to embarrass Ramesses and the Egyptian side. But in another way, it also is already covered, because at that point, the status quo was that Kadesh and Amru and the rest of Syria was already in the possession of the Hittites. And therefore, when the clause in the treaty says that neither side shall come against the other to take any part of what belongs to the other, and that was a mutual clause, then what already belonged to the Hittites was Syria, and just as a general principle, the Egyptians are not supposed to invade any territory belonging to Syria and take it away, and that include Kadesh and Amru. And so it wasn't necessary to spell it out in graphic detail or to mention Kadesh and Amru specifically or to define a border. All of that, which would have been, again, embarrassing to Ramesses, and therefore to save face for Ramesses, they didn't go into any kind of detail and left the subject of Kadesh and Amru and any kind of question of borders. They left that out to assuage his pride.
Fair enough. One of the sort of prominent provisos or stipulations regards fugitives, and that if people from one empire or belonging to one king flee to the other king, they should return them, and so forth. But as you mentioned earlier, Hattusili, with whom Ramesses is making this treaty, he is himself a usurper, and the king he has usurped from, Uri-Teshub, is still alive and potentially has already fled to the Egyptian court. There seems to be something unspoken in this treaty, perhaps implying that Ramesses should be giving Uri-Teshub back to Hattusili once this agreement is formalized. Does he do that, or does it continue to be an ongoing issue?
Well, the whole Uri-Teshub incident is one of those cases where the truth is stranger than fiction. It's one of the more bizarre episodes of ancient Near Eastern history. Perhaps the only thing that's weirder is that famous case of the widow of the pharaoh Nipkururia, who writes to the Hittite king Sapuli-Liuma asking for a Hittite prince to come to marry her, and then dies or is assassinated. But after Uri-Teshub is overthrown, Hattusili by Hittite law cannot, execute him. He sends him into exile in the backwater of the Hittite Empire, but he escapes. Tries to first go to Babylonia. He's rounded up, but then he slips the bonds of Hittite control and finally ends up at the court of Ramesses II. Some would argue that he escaped and went to Egypt after the treaty was signed. But again, given the fugitive clause, this would be madness. By the way, the fugitive clause doesn't include just one or groups of individuals. It also includes territories. This would put an end to cases like the kingdom of Amru, whose king even defected the whole territory back and forth. So that was another thing that would prevent, say, Kadesh or Amru from ever switching sides. But getting back to Uri-Teshub, the idea that he would have gone to Egypt after the treaty was signed is ludicrous. So he must have already been there. I don't think he was necessarily grandfathered in, as it were. And so the fact that he isn't deported repatriated, I suppose is the better word, to the Hittite court is very strange. The sources we have for this are a series of dozens of letters of cuneiform texts that were found in the Hittite archives. That's a diplomatic source that's second only to the famous Amarna letters from the time of the late 18th dynasty. Unfortunately, these collection of letters between Ramesses II and the Hittite court are rather fragmentary. And so piecing together what happened is more difficult. But the strangest thing is the gist of what we can get from these correspondence concerning Uri-Teshub is that when he turns up at the Hittite court, at the Ramesses court, and he has an entourage of loyal people with him. It seems that when Hattusili first hears about it, he writes, including to the Babylonian emperor. And he tells the Babylonian emperor that my enemy has escaped and gone to Egypt, and that I have asked the king of Egypt to return him, but he did not return my enemy, and it implies that this is a cause for war. But when we find actual letters between Ramses and the Hittites, the strangest thing is that Hattusili is not demanding that Ramses seize Uriteshep and repatriate him to Hatti, but instead he is saying, get hold of Uriteshep and make sure that he stays in Egypt, put him under house arrest and keep him there, and make sure that he doesn't go on the run again. And Ramses responds in saying, I don't know who you're talking about. At first, he denies that he even knows who Uriteshep is. And when he finally admits that, oh yeah, that Uriteshep guy, I don't know where he is. He's flown the coop. And so they get into this big disagreement about what's happened. And it seems that as soon as Uriteshep got wind that it's possible after the peace treaty that he might actually be repatriated or extradited, that he basically realizes that the gig is up and that he has to get out of Egypt before the pharaoh decides to hand him back to his uncle, and may even have gotten himself smuggled out of Egypt. One of the strangest references in these very fragmentary letters is something about a fishing boat, of all things. Now, why would you mention such a humble little craft as a fishing boat in a diplomatic letter between two great kings, unless perhaps it's the means by which the deposed Hittite king Uriteshep snuck out of Egypt? You can just imagine this picture of this deposed former Hittite king, hiding under a tarpaulin or something like that, as they smuggle him out of Egypt in a little fishing boat. Again, it's a fun scenario, maybe completely.
I was imagining like Raiders of the Lost Ark with the baskets.
Hiding under a basket. Who knows? I mean, again, that is speculative. But on the other hand, why would they mention a fishing boat in the diplomatic letter between two kings that are discussing the missing fugitive Hittite king? So it's really bizarre, actually. And at one point in a couple of these letters, Hattusili demands that the pharaoh expend gold, silver, bronze, and soldiers and chariots in order to find Uriteshep, track him down, and bring him home. And after denying that he even knows where this guy is, Ramses makes a number of sarcastic remarks, such as, perhaps he went to these various places in Syria, including Kadesh, and he says, maybe he went there. Do you know, is the ruler of that country really so reliable? Maybe he went here. Do you really trust the king of that country who's your vassal, et cetera, et cetera? And so there's this sort of tactical battle of wits between these two kings. But the bottom line is, rather than demanding that the Egyptians take hold of Uriteshep and extradite them, what Hattusili really wants the Egyptians to do is to track Uriteshep, who's run away, and seize him and bring him back to Egypt for safekeeping. And so it's the exact opposite of what you would expect. And I think what's going on here is, given Uriteshep's track record for being slippery as an eel, and the danger that he might find safe harbor somewhere, or might even come back to the Hittite homeland and raise loyal supporters and perhaps even troops, because he seems to have always had a kind of loyal following. and he could even threaten, once again, challenge Hattusili for the throne, that Hattusili realized that the safest thing is to keep him on ice in Egypt, where he was far away and could be kept out of trouble.
Given the known superstitiousness, not as a derogatory term, of some of the Hittite rulers, like Mursili II, who credits the plague that afflicts Hatti as a direct result of Suppiluliuma's occasional breaking of treaties or deceitfulness. I wonder if Hattusili was deeply concerned that Uriteshub was technically the legitimate ruler, and if he was forced to be in a position where he might have to fight him or kill him, that could bring such divine calamities back to Hatti as had previously afflicted them.
Well, there's certainly a religious element to it and a legal element to it, because the first thing you might ask, well, why didn't he just basically have Uriteshub killed? If you go back to earlier Hittite history, there was a period when Hittite royalty were basically killing each other off right, left, and center. And it had gotten so bad that finally one of the early Hittite kings issued this thing called the Edict of Telepinu. And Telepinu said basically, killing a member of Hittite royalty was essentially off limits. And so that it became a taboo. Even if he overthrew a Hittite king, his life was sacrosanct. And so this was taken so seriously, in part because of religious reasons that were involved with the law, which was sanctioned by the Hittite gods, that you could do anything with Hattusili except kill him. I mean, with Uriteshub. So that's the ultimate solution, as it were, but it was off the table. But also because he had overthrown Uriteshub, and of course the gods to some extent had chosen Uriteshub. He had taken the oath of kingship, which was and been anointed with oil to become a king. Then very much like what you hear in the Bible about, King David or Solomon being anointed with oil. This was a universal practice in the ancient Near East, and it represented being anointed by the gods. And so by overthrowing a king, you were violating the divine will of the gods. And so you had to have a very good reason for this. He labored under a sense of illegitimacy that was not merely political, but also sacrilegious. And one of the more remarkable documents for his reign is what is known as the Apology of Hattusili. And basically, it's a statement where he essentially makes a claim that one of the Hittite gods has essentially ruled in his favor, that he has essentially made a kind of divine lawsuit, claiming that he has the right to become king, and that Uriteshub had done so many wrong things against him that Uriteshub deserved to be overthrown, and that Hattusili deserved to take his throne, and that that Hattusili was innocent of sacrilege for doing so. And so, from that point of view, there was as much of a kind of religious sanction or a religious background to this as was the case with Mursili II's plague prayers. And if it didn't go off, as it were, or if he couldn't basically make a religious case that his actions were legitimate, then, or I'm sure Hattusili was worried that he could suffer just as bad a fate as happened to his great grandfather, Suppiluliuma I.
Dovetailing from that, there's one last clause in the treaty that you particularly emphasize as a sort of almost a marker in the culture difference between Hattusili and Ramesses' point of view. At one point, the treaty invokes that the Egyptian pharaoh must come to the aid of any of Hattusili's heirs if their inheritance is contested. but the same clause does not exist for the Egyptians. It doesn't say Hattusili has to come and defend the rights of Ramesses' heirs. And this I thought was a really interesting discussion in the book that you highlighted. So I'd like to get your sort of this expanded view on it. Why does Ramesses have to come to the aid of Hattusili's successor, but not vice versa? What is the difference in mindset and culture there?
Well, there's a couple of things. Part of it is, as you say, cultural and ideological. The idea that the throne of Horus would ever owe its continuity to a bunch of foreigners, a bunch of what literally the Egyptians would call hillbillies, the Hasutiu, those of the mountains, was utterly unthinkable to the Egyptians. And so this was not something they would ever accept or desire. But the reason why Hattusili is proposing it is, again, he's a usurper. He's come to the throne illegally. And once he is gone, are they going to accept his son as his heir? Has he created a new dynasty? Or will the descent of the Hittite throne resume through the descendants of his brother Muwatalli? Will a son of the deposed Uriteshep take the throne, or some other collateral branch of the Hittite royal house that is not a descendant of Hattusili take the throne? Will there be a free for all? Will, at the very least, Hattusili's heir be challenged to become the new Hittite king once, as the Hittite texts say, Hattusili goes to his fate? Or even while he is still alive, will there be armed rebellion against him, as he's so worried, especially if, Uriteshep, escapes and shows up with an army that he himself has raised against Hattusili? So for all these reasons, Hattusili is afraid that, either in his lifetime or afterwards, somebody will challenge his newly forged dynasty, and that he needs outside help. And so therefore he has contracted, quite literally, with the pharaoh to send military aid to the defense of himself and his heirs if it should ever be needed. But as far as the pharaoh is concerned, such help is both unnecessary but also unthinkable. And therefore, there is no such provision, reciprocal provision. And there's one little detail that is in the text that I suspect is a little Egyptian edit, because it says that, this is what's almost certainly part of the the original Hittite text, because it says, now one day I, Hattusili, will go to my fate. And of course, this is what the Hittites always say when somebody dies, they've gone to their fate. And, my son shall take my place, and blah, blah, blah. And Ramesses will continue to protect me. But it says, but Ramesses, who shall live forever. And I have a feeling that business about Ramesses living forever was an Egyptian edit that they snuck into the text. Somehow I can't believe that the Hittites would have flattered him that much. Ramesses can't help himself and show himself to be superior.
And that note of sort of arrogance will come up again in the second part of this conversation. But to wrap up the treaty itself, the key goal of the Silver Treaty promises to end the conflict between these two kings and these two lands, the land of Egypt and the land of Hatti, with the acknowledgement that the historical records are terribly fragmentary. Things might change with new documentation, new excavations. Does the peace hold, or are there any hints of further conflict afterwards?
As far as we know, there is no further conflict. The treaty basically works. On the other hand, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was sunshine and butterflies. I suspect that even in Ramesses' time, it was something of a cold peace, and we'll see when we begin to look at the actual correspondence between the two sides in detail during the later years of Ramesses, that it wasn't all smooth sailing.
Very good. Thank you. So, Professor Brand, thank you so much for explaining the massive text that is the Silver Treaty for us. As always, there'll be links in the episode description if people want to learn more. But thank you very much for joining us. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed talking to you again.
Once again, my thanks to Professor Peter Brand for joining the podcast to offer his insights and his unique perspectives on these ancient peoples. If you would like to learn more about Professor Brand's work, you can find links in the episode description. And if you want to know more about Ramesses, consider Peter's recent book, Ramesses II, Egypt's Ultimate Pharaoh, available at all good retailers. Thanks for listening. I'll see you soon.